Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again in another Tuesday discussion of Ayn Rand essays. Today, we have an honored guest, Lisa VanDamme, to discuss with James the essay of the Comprachicos. So with that being said, I leave you with the discussion. I'll be behind scenes to track super chats.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. Yes, we have, I'm sure the Ayn Rand Center UK audiences are now very familiar with Lisa VanDamme. She's one of the outstanding private educators in North America today, the fountainhead behind VanDamme Academies. And of course, you probably know her from her ARC series, Enjoying Parenting, which I'm very much enjoying, even though I'm not even a parent.
My phone just went off to remind me of this.
But she brings to bear on this topic the experience of both being a rational parent and one of the outstanding educators of our time. So last week we covered some of the historical and philosophical issues, how getting off, of course, to a philosophical bad start with Kant and Rousseau, certain educational theorists and educators from Europe began a new education movement, crashed on the shores of America most dramatically with John Dewey and progressive education. And this is Ayn Rand's devastating critique of certain educational techniques that are broadly termed progressive education, which had a great influence on education in the 20th century and still, unfortunately, in the 21st century. We covered a lot of that, but with you here, what I want to talk about, I'm sure you'd have insight into each of these points as well. But one thing that interests me is because you take a philosophically opposite stance, in effect, from everything that Ayn Rand's criticizing here. You know, Ayn Rand, perhaps the thing we didn't discuss last week, and the thing that most interested me, are a couple of comments that Ayn Rand makes in this about the lack of mental integration in progressive education. She points out, for example, how the look-say method of teaching reading is anti-conceptual. She talks about how it's randomly associated things that are put together within a single subject matter, so that even within a single subject matter, such as history or mathematics, there's no integration, but disintegration within the subject matter. And she implies that the authority of de-emphasizing the authority of the teacher and de-emphasizing subject matter as such, fails to train. We need a subject matter in order to train the conceptual faculty. The conceptual faculty doesn't develop all on its own. So with all that context built up, I wonder if you could tell us how you do the opposite, how you attempt to, as an educator, integrate the subject matters, and more than that, integrate the conceptual training through those subject matters in students.
Sure. There's so many directions we could go with this.
Yes.
So I'll just choose one and see where it leads us. One thing that struck me, she spends a lot of time, okay, part of the context for the Comprachicos was another article on the Montessori method, which I didn't have a chance to go and read in preparation for this discussion. But, you know, we know, I'm sure the audience knows a certain amount about the Montessori method and about Ayn Rand's esteem for Montessori. So she talks a lot about what is necessary and what is established as in terms of psychoepistemological priming in those first years of schooling in preschool, so from the ages of 3 to 7, and speaks in very grim and terrifying terms about what happens if they're not given proper training and psychoepistemological priming in those years. So I won't go down the road of discussing that, but what occurred to me is that it's my expertise and my experience comes really beyond those years. We start children at about the age of 5 through the age of about 13. We do have a Montessori environment for kids for the 5 and 6-year-olds, but then it changes to our own approach and methodology after that. And because the emphasis was on the psychoepistemological priming of those first years, I thought, well, how does that translate into the later years? Let's put aside the issue of whether irreparable harm is done and all that comes up in the article. And So with, you just mentioned subject areas and disciplines and content, and that's what differentiates the 2nd through 8th grade curriculum for us, is that we move away from the Montessori method into this breaking down the curriculum into certain disciplines with experts in their fields, teaching it in a more guided, more lecture-based, more teacher at the front of the classroom sort of style. And it occurred to me that I often use the term intellectual disciplines, which I got from Arthur Bester as defining a high quality education, that there are certain realms that we've identified, intellectual realms that we've identified over time, each represent a kind of different outlook and different approach to understanding and thinking about the world. So, for example, history lets us look at the impact of ideas on civilizations, and to take this kind of grand scale view where we can boil things down into essences and the most important world shaping ideas and figures. Okay, well, that's one way of looking at the world and conceptualizing and understanding it. Literature allows us to stylize, kind of extrapolate away from the everyday into this stylized universe with pointed stories to get us to important themes and insights and to concretize those. Okay, so each of the science allows us to quantify and understand the mechanics of the physical world, and each of them represents a discipline. And so I sort of started to think of it in terms of the kind of generalized psychoepistemological priming that happens in those early years, down to a more refined kind of psychoepistemology that builds on that and continues in the later years. So it has to be done through the delivery of content. You know, if you're trying to effectively teach the intellectual discipline of history, that is most effectively taught by making a careful study of the most important themes in history. And you've got this kind of, she talks about vicious cycles in the article. You've got the virtuous cycle of learning a methodology for approaching historical questions, and also learning the fundamental, most important, most significant content about history that is important for a person inheriting the wisdom of the past to know, and then apply to their life experience after that. So anyway, that's one thing that I found really interesting, is to think about the development of these intellectual disciplines as a refinement on the psychoepistemological priming that goes on in those early years.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So in contrast, just to give it the contrasts that Ayn Rand does in these stages of education, we have preschool and kindergarten, which emphasizes socialization. And in a partially or largely unsupervised setting, it's considered important that the kids sort of interact on their own before they've really learned manners, much less any subject matter. Here they are socializing and putting that emphasis on it, as if somehow subject matter would be interfering, is opposing a certain, say, structured conceptual set of learning toys or tools or activities that Montessori would use to develop a conceptual faculty. It's sort of do your own thing on your own, because we don't want to interfere with their natural, as if they would naturally conceptually. And then when you get to the stage where there are subject matters which actually need to be learned, particularly in subjects like history or what used to be called civics or social studies, I recall from education, it was a discussion method. It's almost as if in literature and history and civics, the teacher is saying, well, your opinion is as good as my opinion. And let's just have a free-form discussion. At least in math, to some extent, there was a subject matter that was taught, even if it wasn't taught the best way. At least there was a subject matter to be taught. But as Ayn Rand emphasizes, when you approach education in this way, when you de-emphasize the authority role of the teacher, there is something to learn here. Now be quiet and learn it for a minute. You're actually not training what needs to be trained, the conceptual faculty. And as you're pointing out, and that's what I really find interesting, is that there are certain subject matters that are absolutely critical to develop. I mean, Ayn Rand makes a great point in many places that our first real lessons about morality and values come from stories and literature. Mm-hmm. Without literature, without some exposure to that art or art in general, how you approach the subject of values with a child. Is it like Aesop's fables and stuff that we teach morality to young children? Just to choose one example, that there are certain distinct subject matters which are suited not only to a basic thing that the person should just learn, but also the training of the conceptual faculty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because, again, as you're talking about all these themes that come up, my mind goes in about 15 different directions at once. And that's, I will confess to the public that just before we came on the show, I said, I'll need you to lead the discussion because I read this probably more than a decade ago, was very moved by the content of it, as I think most people are when they read it, because so many of the themes within it resonate with our personal experience. But going back to read it this time, I was struck by what a broad scope it takes and how many kind of extreme assertions it makes about the consequences of certain approaches to education. And so just the broad brush it takes makes it difficult. We could take any one paragraph and talk about that for a whole show.
Well,
so
she does stop at each point, and as you pointed out earlier, she stops and she'll at the beginning after preschool or kindergarten, she'll say, "Well, has that ruined them for life? To what extent can free will?" correct that, or some better education or experience correct that? What efforts can the child do to overcome that? Is it hopeless at that point? And at each step, she pauses and she says, well, maybe, but at each step, it becomes it seems like a much smaller and smaller group is going to survive the wreckage of these educational techniques. And so I'd ask you, do you have different levels of experience with kids coming in from other educational experiences, say more progressive educational experiences into your school, and what kind of a challenge do they present, if any?
That's an interesting question. So in reading the Comprachicos, I'm curious whether you had at all the same feeling that I did. It felt almost like reading Anthem. It felt sort of like dystopian fiction, not in the sense that she means it. She's trying to ring alarm bells of very serious, very damaging harms of the modern approach to education. But it read in a very abstracted, stylized, sort of extreme form. So I found myself kind of being torn between saying, well, is this literally true? And then kind of pushing back against it a little bit in some of the literal kind of emphatic extreme claims about the effect at any particular stage, but then also stepping back and taking it more as this kind of stylized picture of almost like I imagine her reading Dewey and Rousseau and extrapolating as a thought experiment what would be the consequences of this in practice. So that's part of the context for my answer to your question, which is that I have not, now I have to confess, I have limited experience, even though I have 25 years of teaching experience and 25 years of receiving students from a variety of educational backgrounds. My school has 140 students in it and 15 in the kindergarten class. So every one of those 25 years has been an experiment of 15 children coming from, a certain kind of demographic and cultural background. So I wouldn't want to make any claims myself about how these different educational backgrounds shape them. But what I will say is that the picture in my experience is much more hopeful and optimistic than the one that I see here, even though the themes, the dreary, dismal themes about the trends of education, I am not so optimistic about those. But the possibility of a child, I don't know. The children, when they come in at 5, come from a great variety of educational backgrounds. And I feel able to kind of bring them into the fold, no matter what those educational backgrounds are. And my guess is just, well, I would say 2 things. One is just the resilience of a child's mind. I don't have the sense that any of them are being subjected to Comprachicos style abuse in their preschool classrooms. Their preschool classrooms might be lacking in a significant and substantial way, but I don't see somebody trying to beat reason out of them. So that's one thing, is that their experiences don't seem to match in terms of actual day-to-day experience, what I'm reading here. The other thing is that, to the extent that those themes would be present, there's such an inherent drive for understanding at that age, which she talks about, in saying, like, if you could observe in an adult the same kind of intensity of learning that goes on in an infant, they'd all be geniuses. So to the extent that it's not presented to a student, this kind of orderly approach to systematizing and gaining information and conceptualizing, children are just inherently on a quest to do that all the time, and will take that in from whatever source it's given to them. So I think a lot of the kids, for example, just don't have preschool as background. They've been learning at home, but every time their parent explains something to them, something at the most trivial level, that's being filed away as order and belief that it's worth it and the world is intelligible. And they're hungry for that all the time. It comes to them in many different sources, whether it's just playing in the dirt and getting lessons directly from reality, or whether it's parents giving them explanations of things.
What a wonderfully hopeful perspective that is, because with dealing with children of the variety of ages that you have, what you're sort of saying is, at least when they're still kids, there is still hope.
There is, yeah.
Kids, by their nature, do want to learn and enjoy and get on that virtuous cycle of positive learning.
So there's one practical thing. We accept students at any point in the school year and at any point in the arc of the school, kindergarten through 8th grade. So as on the extreme end, I'll tell you, I had a student who was expelled from a local high school and I knew his parents told me up front that he had been expelled. So I called the school to find out why he'd been expelled. And he was kind of a troublemaker, but the troublemaking was benevolent enough mischief that I wasn't concerned about accepting him into our school.
He sounds like the loner that I
He does, but he wasn't. I don't want to glorify and glamorize him because it's not. He was a mischief maker who may have been substituting mischief for any kind of satisfaction he could have been getting at school. So in that sense, maybe there's a little bit of truth to that, but I didn't see in him any kind of inherent drive that he really wants to be learning in the school. He just had no experience with meaningful learning, and so no desire for it. It wasn't present in him, and maybe he just fulfilled the void with mischief. In any case, I thought he was worth taking a chance on. And we had him for 4 months. I think he had been expelled late in his 8th grade year. We had him for 4 months, and it was absolutely a world-changing, revolutionary experience for him. He loved school. He had never loved school before. He had never learned. There wasn't some other kind of educational experience filling this for him. But even at that stage, once there were passionate people who were experts in their field who could meaningfully and effectively convince him that there was real value to the material that they were trying to teach him, and that they were teaching from that premise that this is really valuable. You need to know it to it's going to be such a pleasure to you to understand it, and you'll feel empowered by it in your own, to be teaching from that premise. He bought into it like that. That won't be true of everybody that comes in at that stage, but it was a very, very powerful and extreme example of how that is possible even at that late stage.
Well, you are then just are a welter of positive experiences with education. One of the examples I used last week in our discussion was from my own background.
Okay.
And now, mind you, in fourth grade, the ages 8, I believe I was about 8 years old. I turned 9 at the end of that year. They put me into what was called an alternative school, where grammar school kids were in effect controlling their own curriculum. Study what you like. You don't need to, if you don't want to study history, don't study. If you don't want to study math, don't study. Well, I know, even my parents were a bit concerned. Well, aren't there some basics in math they need to learn? And how are we really going to train their little logical minds if we're not training them? They even had, without any Ayn Rand philosophy, a grip on the idea that this might not be the best way to go. But there I was, little 8-year-old, by my own evaluation, a bit of a savage, because I'm 8 years old.
Yeah.
And I'm in no position to determine what I should be learning or how I should be learning it.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, what would be fun? What would be fun to me would be, well, if I had my druthers at 8, I'd be reading comic books all day.
Okay.
And so, fine, go read comic books. And the other time, I want to be exposed to different languages. So an hour of German, an hour of Spanish, an hour of French, and just expose me. I'm not really learning any one of them in depth. I'm just getting exposure to vocabulary and sound and stuff. By the end of the first half of the year, I hated it. I wanted out. I was begging my parents, get me out, get me out. I'm falling behind my friends in certain ways.
Yeah. I have encountered many students with that experience who go to Waldorf schools, which are on that methodology, that premise, more the Rousseau access of education. And there was one student I had who transferred into our school, again, at a pretty late level, 6th or 7th grade. And she said she had been given this freedom to define her own curriculum over the course of the day. And at some point, at the end of the day, they had to meet and kind of report what they had done and what they had learned. And she said when, in several days in succession, she had to attend that meeting, reflect on her day, and come up with the answer, nothing. She thought, something's wrong here. I need to do something else. I need some help. I need some guidance. I need some direction. I'm not capable of doing this on my own.
The same kind of, what did they call them? It wasn't they had a term like that, some sort of counselor who would oversee the kids. Yeah. It wasn't really a teacher, right, so much as an sort of monitor of their doing a check. And they'd meet with my parents, and I'd be in the room when they'd have that discussion. And I remember she actually said that I was an exceptional kid because I did have some direction. And so I was thinking, even now in retrospect, I think if I was one of the
what were the others
what were the other ones wandering, or what days they were wandering around in? And continuing that year after year, that must have hobbled their education.
Well, that's part of the reason that, because in the Comprachicos, Ayn Rand mostly focuses on those 3 to 7 years. I mean, she talks about then grade school and high school and college, but doesn't give a lot of content to what that would look like. I think, honestly, in part because she still felt like she could count on her readers to have some understanding of what that content should look like. Now we're getting so far from that I'm not sure anybody does. But I always want to forestall the idea that what the child needs to learn is fundamentally psychoepistemological in nature, and in the sense that you can kind of fill it in with anything. So let's say you do make an ambitious, thorough, guided, orderly study of comic books. Isn't that enough? Well, I think there are a lot of educators, even who would be, who would read the Comprachicos and feel sympathetic with that, who still might think that it's kind of the mental order that's needed, and it's the discipline, and it's the ambition and the self-drive and all that, and not any specific content that's needed, and not imposition from outside by a teacher directing them. And I just feel very strongly that we've got this legacy of wisdom that is being lost, that we can free ride for some amount of time, but it's not gonna last forever. And if we don't have generations of kids who understand the foundations of freedom, who understand the basics of physics, who are, well-versed in literature and have the depth of soul to engage in really meaningful reflection. If we lose that completely and just have, kids who are ambitious and tech savvy and drive their own path, we're in trouble.
I have to say, I have known both parents of your students and graduates of your school, and they are not what I would call the problem with our society. Those are the heroes trying to keep it going in that regard, in my view, really. But in my experience, most kids don't have VanDamme Academy, or even a foundation in Montessori, basics. And if it weren't for a few good teachers that I had, like a history teacher who it was all discipline and facts, and you're going to learn it, but she was teaching it conceptually. It was Western civilization, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, and she taught it. So in my little mind, I had a concept under which I could integrate the art, the science, the politics of the time. And so I'm getting a conceptual grip on history. And if it wasn't for a teacher like that, in the midst of this public school education, I'm not sure. And then I look at so many of my contemporaries, I get the idea that socialization in kindergarten and preschool did encourage them to be bullies. I get the idea that a failure to teach reading and math basics did give them a hole in their brain and a terrible lack of self-esteem and self-confidence that has continued to mark them through the course of their life. In a really profound way in terms of their self-esteem. So I do see the effect in it, as Ayn Rand is saying it, but they never come from a VanDamme Academy. They do come from the more, and sometimes I was not raised, I was raised in a nice middle-class neighborhood. So the kids who went to the private schools, the fancy yet upscale schools, were sometimes getting the worst, the very worst education. At least public school was a little slow to, you get, let's say at one moment, then you get phonics in the next in the public school, whereas these kids were being taught progressive, and they were coming out the worst. That's my own personal experience with it. But even in my personal experience, there's still the capacity to turn it around. It may take more and more effort.
Two things from that. One is that, so your hopeful theme there was, often if you have just a handful of good teachers, one good teacher, a handful of good teachers, at least it gives you this experience that lets you know what real learning actually looks like. So if we have the experience of knowing what real learning actually looks like, at least we have some kind of filter for differentiating our other experiences from that, because a lot of people just don't even have that experience at all. The other thing that I just found fascinating here is that Kyle Steele and I, in our parenting podcast, spent a couple of weeks talking about a book called Hold On to Your Kids, which was about the importance of having an attachment to adults, specifically to your parents, but those attachment relationships can be to teachers or to mentors or to other adults in your life. And the parallels to the Comprachicos were really fascinating. There's one passage I wish I could quickly pull up, but such a long article, I won't be able to find it. But there was one passage. So she describes this placing a premium on adaptability, or adapting to the group, and the destructive effects that has on the psyche, on the psychoepistemology, on the person's soul, on the person's emotional life, just everything. And there were a lot of parallels to this book, Hold On to Your Kids, because she was talking about how kids tend to look up to their older siblings, how they gravitate toward adults, how they want role models, they want people who know more than they do to show them the way, and how important that is. And what the Hold On to Your Kids book stresses is that because they want that so desperately, in the absence of having that from adults who can provide it for them in a consistent and meaningful way, they will seek that attachment somewhere else, and they'll get it from their peers. And what they describe in that book matches so perfectly. I wish I could find the passage. Her description of turning to the mob of the classroom, and how, a bunch of children, she uses a lot of very damning derogatory language in this context, because they don't have the maturity and the wisdom to be able to provide guidance or
context. And so they naturally subject the collective for the objective as the standard of truth.
Right. And so you end up going to a group of, people in an equally savage state to you, to try to find your sense of guidance and direction and mooring. And that's just devastating to a child.
But boy, is that true. I mean, socialization with my peers, I remember, and the younger back I go in my memory, the more this is true. I looked up to my dad and my older brother, and I wanted to be just like them, and I wanted to learn from them. And even if I was incapable of doing it yet, I was imitating what they were doing, diligently looking up to do. I'm not looking, how does Ayn Rand say it? Look at my level. I was trying to look up to the next level, because that's what I wanted to imitate. That's what I wanted to model. And if you don't have good teachers and good models that way, I can only imagine the effect is devastating on the developing, not only the psychoepistemological, but the psychological development of the child, the emotion. Ayn Rand gives you a sense of, in this article too, of the inner fear, terror, lack of control, chaos, that the inner mind must be, as it's, rather than being educated and trained in subject matters and how to think and be a conceptual being, rather than develop that self-confidence and self-reliance, they're developing an inner chaos, fear, and insecurity. And so it's that lack of self-esteem that's laying the foundation, rather than secure attachment with mentors or teachers, much less a trust of their own mind.
Yeah, one of my favorite phrases in the whole, this is a long article, and one of my favorite phrases was like 4 words. It was a combination, students graduating and then having, voicing okay. The phrase was something like oracular declarations or oracular pronouncements and blank stares of silence or something. And that, so you draw upon whatever news headlines you've memorized, or themes from that you got in school, but they're just memorized bromides and jargon. So they come out as these.
The conceptual is treated perceptually. They never really learn what a concept is. They just memorize. And the funny thing is that so much of progressive education started out with this: we want to de-emphasize rote memorization. We want to de-emphasize, just memorizing facts and stuff. And at the end of the day, rather than teaching a conceptual faculty, all they have is a perceptual rote memory of stuff, and they turn the highly abstract back as if it's just some perceptual concrete.
Right. That you can kind of fake it by having the memorization be of abstract statements. So if it's a memorization of abstract statements, it's less obvious that what you're doing is memorization. Memorization, we usually think of as just kind of facts and dates and names and that sort of thing. But memorization of conceptual abstract statements is the most disastrous kind of memorization you can make education consist of.
The irony is that if someone had given me just a list of, history is my subject, and if someone had given me just a list of facts, there'd be no way that the limits of my consciousness could contain or organize and retain all those facts.
Yeah.
When people talk to me, they say, "What a remarkable memory you have." It's really not memory at all, but
Mm.
the way I've conceptualized those facts.
Yeah.
What I do is I summon up the file folder, and then
Yeah.
the file folder within the file folder, and
Yeah.
and the interconnections. Then suddenly, so not only do I have the facts there, they're
Yeah.
available because they're available conceptually, but now
Mhm.
they're also useful because they were accessed conceptually.
Yeah.
So in any subject matter, it seems to me there has to be an actual subject matter
Mhm.
that is taught, and it's, when it comes to history, it's not so much whether it's American history or English history, the country where you're, say, growing up. It's not so much the country's history as it is the history of it.
Yeah.
History has to be taught in a conceptual way.
Yeah. 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 That's really interesting. One of the things we do at my school for history is we have history on a 3-year cycle, ancient European American. And so that starts at kindergarten. At kindergarten, ancient history looks like what was life for a child in the ancient world. It's just to give them some sense of the distance between life as they know it today and life in previous times. It's to get them aware of kind of general places and times and people, and it serves the purpose, starts to give them this kind of the conceptual framework that they can fill in a much more elaborate and abstract level as they go along. I am absolutely disastrously ignorant of history, I think, because I just never was taught it. It was absolutely gone as a subject from my schooling by the time I was going to school and at the very poor public schools that I attended. But also, I think you need those file folders built early on so that you can start filling them and fleshing them out and making new ones as you grow.
Well, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
And a subject like mathematics, I know, maybe not another one of your forte. By the way, I want to tell everyone, Lisa VanDamme is one of the most sensitive, educated, sophisticated understanders of literature I have ever. She is one of the few lecturers who has rendered me in tears from her lectures. So brilliant and sensitive is her understanding and love of Western literature. But it seems to me that, and as I say, literature, I love literature. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love literature. And it is the way we teach kids values.
Yeah.
I mean, how else do we approach teaching morality and values to the very young, except through like storytelling? And then as that develops, and when you start appreciating the nuances of character development and plot development, when you get, say, into high school, now you're understanding those very things at a much deeper, real human and even philosophical level. And literature is really the best access, in effect, to moral philosophy before they're ready to learn a subject like moral philosophy. But something like mathematics, how else do they learn basic logical? Logic is really important. Reality is an absolute, and 2 and 2 is 4, and you have to be logical or you're making a mistake.
Yeah.
So how else they so emphasize method, but in any of these subjects, how do you get to method without a subject matter?
Yeah. That's I think we've discussed before that my eldest daughters both attend a great books college called Thomas Aquinas College. And when we visited that school, that could be a whole subject in itself, how that relates to the content of the Comprachicos. But when we visited that school to evaluate it, I talked to some students there and to ask them about their experience. And most of them said, and I believe my daughters would say this now, that the most formative part of freshman year is their study of Euclid. So they spend a year studying Euclid's elements. They start the proofs from chapter 1 and go through every one of them in the whole book. They, on a daily basis, have to come prepared to do the proof on the board without any support materials. They get their name pulled at random, and it's just them and a piece of chalk, and they have to go up and demonstrate the proof. But I don't know how many people have had experience with Euclid, but it's kind of your grade school math, not to compare them, but that sort of the intensity of logical rigor that's required to understand the proofs. And they build on each other, one to the next. So you really have to have mastered the earlier ones to master the others. But what they say is that talk about psychoepistemological training, the sheer fact of having to have engaged at that level of depth with that kind of mental rigor. And, Montessori has this wonderful virtue in all her materials that it's built into them, a feedback mechanism. If you get the wrong cylinder and try to put it in the hole, it's not going to fit. So you get correction from reality. Well, with Euclid, if you've lost a step, you're done. You're lost. There's nothing you can do.
There's no more demanding a teacher than reality, eh?
Yeah, right. Exactly. So in any case, it's your point about the logical rigor of math. They all pointed to that as the thing that helped them with literature, with theology, with history, with all the other subjects that
everything else, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Actually, what I like, just in summary, what's pleasant about this conversation is that it reminds me that some really great improvements have happened since Ayn Rand wrote. Largely, the look-say method has gone out, although it still can be found in places. Some of the worst methods that she's talking about have gone, or we have. I know not all Montessori schools are the same, and parents have to do their own investigation. Sure. Some pretty much just call themselves Montessori, while many others, and there are good Montessori schools out there, are more connected to what Maria Montessori herself taught. But those are positive developments. It's not quite as bleak in one sense as it was, and we have places like VanDamme Academy. And I'd encourage parents within our earshot of checking out if there's any chance that you live in the Southern California region, especially, of sending your kid, or even if you just live in North America, you might want to consider sending your kid to VanDamme Academy. Do we have any questions or super chat questions at this point, Alejandro?
Yes, we have 4 super chats and 2 of them are questions. So let me thank first Robert and Jaime for their super chats without any, just praises for you and Lisa. And Bradley also has a question. He says, what are your opinions on self-directed learning?
Self-directed learning. So I think that I don't know when the question was asked, but I do think I answered that a little bit, but I can say a little bit more. So I think the most important thing we can do for children is give them high quality intellectual mentors in the subject areas that will best empower them to live a truly fulfilled life, that will allow them to develop the kind of insight and wisdom and depth of soul and ability to think with clarity that is going to impact every aspect of their existence, no matter what career they go into, and outside of career, in relationships, in politics, in all realms of life. So that's a monumental task for a school to take on, basically to say, what is the body of knowledge and what are the intellectual skills that a person needs for them to be able to thrive in this way? Now, we're at my school doing our best to identify what those are. And to a certain extent, we have to draw just on kind of cultural tradition, because we can't, we're not all super geniuses who can, I'm sure they're going to change over time, but we can't write it from scratch. So, roughly those are, you need to know history. You need to know what has happened on a grand scale view and understand the consequences of certain ideas and certain policies and certain practices. If you don't, got no means of securing a successful future. You need to have read great literature to have the insights of the most penetrating, most powerful, most thoughtful, soulful, deep minds that have ever existed. to help you create this lens of new understanding on the world. You need the rigor of math. You need a depth of understanding of science so that you really truly appreciate the order and intelligibility of the universe. You've seen it played out yourself time and time again, and you are armed with a certain understanding that's, so, try to cover that briefly, but because I think all those things are vitally necessary for a child to truly, for a human being to truly thrive, I don't want to leave them to their own devices. I don't want to say, well, you who have no experience with these things and are just kind of new to the world here, I'm going to let you dictate the terms instead of drawing upon this legacy of centuries of wisdom that we have that's going to empower them if I deliver it to them in an effective way. So I'm not on the axis of self-directed learning at all. I'm on the axis of very directed by mode. I think often people have an association with directed learning of being this dreary, memorization based, oppressive, boring, I understand that and I sympathize that with that completely. But so I have to differentiate myself from that. But I want kids to be gifted with this legacy of wisdom by people who deeply appreciate it, deeply understand it, know its power to improve and enhance their lives, and will deliver it to them on that premise with that goal.
And the other question is also from Bradley. He asks, where is the line between encouraging children to follow their natural individual interests and forcing them to learn a generic curriculum?
Okay, so that's related, obviously, to the first question, but force is such a loaded word. I can't force a child to learn anything. What I can do is prepare a really elaborately delicious banquet for them, and require, in the context of school, that I can try to require that I can, create conditions that are telling them I need and want you to do this, but then they have to buy into it. So I got to do a really good job to get them to buy in. So I don't think of it as force. I think of it as I know what's best for them. I'm going to create this incredibly delicious banquet of opportunity in front of them. And I'm going to tell them that they're required to do it, and then hope that they buy in and devour.
I would just add that until I was about 14, 15, 16, my parents forced me to go to school. And I am grateful they did. I wasn't a fully conceptually developed being. I would not have made good decisions at the age. I mean, at least I had the sense to know that at the age of 8, that self-directed at, 4th grade wasn't working out for me. But that was about it. I hated that. I knew that. But the point is, when it comes to kids, the term force needs to be used, as VanDamme says, very, very contextually. Kids need to be forced to do certain things because they're not fully adult yet. So, and I'm grateful my parents sent me to school. Thank you very much, because I really didn't have any good judgment on this until I was in my mid-teens. So,
sure.
Just saying.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure my kids would eat candy all day if they were given the opportunity.
Not trust an 8-year-old with their own education,
with their own diet, and I think if the Comprachicos makes you feel anything, it makes you feel the power of education to really fundamentally affect the happiness or unhappiness of somebody's future. So
see, and that's how I look back on it. My happiness, my competence, my self-confidence, my ability to learn new things, and my, the relaxed way I approach learning new things now that gives me such a sense of confidence and self-esteem. I can't imagine without the education that I had how I would feel. I would feel out of control. I would lack self-esteem. I would lack basic confidence in doing anything. Like you point out, just in interacting with human beings, business-wise or personal-wise, it comes down to that level.
Well, and this is going to be a bit difficult to describe, but I'm going to try anyway. I fear that as time goes on and we become more and more distant from what an actual quality education looks like, that we are going to increasingly lose the idea of what happiness can actually mean. So when I read, I happen to be a fan of 19th century literature, and especially Victor Hugo. Now, I know Victor Hugo is an all-time super genius, but when I read Victor Hugo, I feel in his writing and in his world a capacity for a depth of experience that I worry over time people just won't even be capable of having. So we just kind of redefine what it means to be happy as we lose the kind of exposure to and familiarity with an experience with what happiness on the deepest level means. And I do feel like that's what Ayn Rand was getting at too, in talking about their, if you look at people that she's describing as miserable, they might not appear on the surface to be miserable, but what she's describing is a loss, a lack of a potential unrealized for a depth of happiness that you have to be educated to achieve.
That is so profound. That is such a profound insight. People that I've spoken to, it's almost as though the very things that prevent them from ever gaining the insight that would make them truly happy are precisely the things that make it impossible for them to appreciate, say, Victor Hugo or great literature.
Right.
What a profound point that is. You're training souls.
Yeah.
You're training souls. That is well, I could get lost on that all day. More questions, Alejandro. Oh, Alejandro. You may have lost Alejandro.
Yes, just a comment from Bonnie. She says, thank you very much for this inspiring episode. What a value.
Oh.
But that's it.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you. And thank you, Lisa. This was a great talk. Finally, there are a couple things I'd like to just add. Dr. Leonard Peikoff is a brilliant philosopher of education and is really the antidote to John Dewey and everything that he stood for. It's interesting to note Professor Dewey's protege was Sidney Hook, who was Leonard Peikoff's own dissertation advisor when he was getting his PhD. So the actual educational pedigree of Dr. Peikoff comes straight from John Dewey's mouth. But I would advise people interested in this subject to check out Dr. Peikoff's course, which has been converted into a book on the principles of education, and his essay included in that, Why Johnny Can't Think. Dr. Peikoff is a profound influence on my thinking on this topic. I'll bet on Miss VanDamme's and other educators that I know.
Yeah.
And finally, if you do like this sort of content and these kind of discussions, please do become a subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK. We're doing, in my view, some of the most exciting work in objectivism, creating a worldwide community of discussion of objectivism and relating it to current events. And so please hit like, hit subscribe, and really for a modest fee every month, you can take advantage of all kinds of wonderful programs. Don Watkins, his communications boot camp, you can participate yourself if you're a paid subscriber. That by itself is worth it. So please, please consider becoming a subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.